We're talking today with Carl King of Byron Center, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Mr. King, can you begin by telling us just a little bit about yourself? To start with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. When? February 18th, 1924.
Okay. Now, what did your family do at the time?
My dad was a furniture worker. My mother was a housewife.
Okay. Now, was your father able to keep his job through the 30s, or were there layoffs and things?
No, Dad wasn't making any money in the furniture business, and in 1928, he decided to try farming.
Okay.
I call it sharecropper, because he'd raise a crop and split it with the landowner and then move to another farm.
Mm-hmm. And so how long was he doing that?
We did that until 1936, and he wasn't making any money farming. There wasn't much money anywhere, but
right.
But then we came back to Grand Rapids, and those were tough days, and Dad had trouble finding a job, but he finally landed a job in a furniture factory again. Now,
did you stay in school during this time, or did you leave school after 8th grade?
No, I attended 6 different schools in the first 7 years, and then 3 in the 7th grade. I was a hard 7th grader. And then I went to Creston High School for 4 years, and no college.
And when did you finish high school?
1942.
All right. Now, before Pearl Harbor, were you aware at all of what was going on in the world? Did you know there was a war in Europe and that kind of thing?
Well, certainly we knew it. Because it was there, it didn't affect us all that much.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you go to the movies and see newsreels that covered it, or hear things on the radio about it?
Well, it would have been on the radio and the newspapers.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you remember hearing about Pearl Harbor?
Oh, yes.
And do you remember how you heard about it?
Well, as I recall, they announced it in church. Mm-hmm. On a Sunday morning, because there's a lot of time difference between Pearl Harbor and Grand Rapids.
Right.
And so it was announced that Pearl Harbor had been struck by bombers. At that time, it didn't mean all that much to me. I was 17,
mm-hmm.
such a matter.
So you didn't think right away that, okay, there's a war, you might get caught up in it?
No, I think I kind of hoped that.
Mm-hmm. Now, once it happened, were friends of yours starting to go and enlist, or people getting drafted and that kind of thing?
Almost everybody that I was working with were subject to the draft. That is, of the people my age mm-hmm. and somewhat older. And I decided that I couldn't wait. And I really wanted to have my choice of the services, and they told me that I could do that if I volunteered through the draft system. So I did that. I went to the draft board and asked to be put on the next draft. I was 19 at that time. And they put me on the draft, and I got Navy, which I wanted.
All right. Now, did you request Navy?
I did.
Okay. Now, why were you interested in the Navy?
I couldn't figure myself sleeping in the mud.
Mm-hmm. Now, had you ever had any experience on boats or anything like that before?
No, I don't think I'd ever been on a boat at all, even a fishing boat.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, once you signed up, what kinds of things did you have to do in terms of examinations and that kind of thing?
Well, I had a physical. We had that physical in Kalamazoo. And then that was it. I think they just counted your eyes and your ears.
Right. And then did you get to go home, or did they load you on a bus and send you someplace?
No, I was kept at home for a week or so. I'm not sure anymore just how long it was. But there were not many men from the Grand Rapids area going into the Navy. And so when they got around to it, they sent me to Great Lakes. And
Okay, that's the Great Lakes Naval Base in Chicago
yes,
then?
yes.
All right. Now, what was your first impression of Great Lakes when you got there? What did it look like to you?
Well, it really didn't impress me as much of a camp.
Mm-hmm.
The barracks were 2 stories. I didn't expect them to be 2 stories, but I didn't know what I did expect.
Now, what did you do once you got there?
Waited.
Okay. But what kind of training or whatever did they give you there?
Well, in boot camp, they taught us how to march. They taught us how to take orders. Actually, I felt that it was a repeat of my high school band years, because I learned how to march in band,
Right.
and by then I knew which foot to start with.
All right. Did you have any trouble adjusting to military discipline and that kind of thing, taking orders?
No, I did not have difficulty with discipline, because my dad taught me about discipline pretty seriously.
Now, were there guys in there that you were training with who were getting into trouble or having problems, or did most of them do pretty well?
Not in our boot company.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally somebody would step out of bounds, but it was not a serious thing.
Okay. Now, at this point, were you getting any kind of classroom stuff or things like that? Were you sitting down and being taught things, or just mostly marching around?
Not in boot camp.
Okay.
Actually, the purpose of boot camp was to more or less acclimate us to service life and to teach us how to get along with each other
Mm-hmm.
and with our officers.
Now, were there men in your company from all around the country? Were they mostly from the Midwest, or?
Mostly they were from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan
Mm-hmm.
in my boot company.
All right. Did you notice much of a difference between you and the guys from Kentucky and Tennessee?
Well, yeah, we were all farmers. And the guys from Tennessee were basically from the hills, and they talked funny.
All right. Now, how long did the boot camp experience take?
That was 12 weeks.
Okay. And once you completed that, what did you do next?
Well, then we were given an opportunity to sign up for service school, and I did that. Prior to the service time, I had spent some months at the General Motors plant as a tool and die apprentice. And I had a lot of machine shop in high school, and as a tool and die apprentice, I had a lot of machine shop in the early months of my training, and I interrupted my training at General Motors after 7 months to go into service, and I wanted to continue, and well, tool and die was my chosen field. I knew by the time I was a 10th grader in high school that I wanted to be a tool and die maker. So I just felt that the machinist mate service school would be the thing I wanted.
All right. Now, where did you go for that?
At Great Lakes.
That was still at Great Lakes?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what kinds of things were they actually teaching you there?
They taught us how to run the basic machine tools, drill press, the lathe, the milling machine, the shaper. All of these things I'd had in high school and also in my early years in the tool and die apprenticeship. So it was kind of repeat. So I was quite fortunate in that I caught on to machinery pretty fast, and the service school had a little lab that they put the ones who could run the machines in to do things for the camp, and I did that. I was assigned to that for most of the 16 weeks that I was in service school.
Okay. So do things for the camp, I mean, like repairing equipment and
Yes,
things like that
repairing
there?
equipment and making little things. I suppose some of it was for the officers.
Okay. Now, during this period, did you get much of a chance to go off the base, go into the city of Chicago, that sort of thing?
After we got into service school, then we got Liberty every other weekend. And I was a homeboy, and I found out that I could catch a train out of Chicago and come to Grand Rapids and have a few hours with my family or my girlfriend, not this lady. And then if I caught the last train out of Grand Rapids, I would get back to Chicago and just in time to make a station transfer and get to Great Lakes by morning muster.
Now, how long did the train ride from Chicago to Grand Rapids take in those days?
Well, it took a lot less time to come to Grand Rapids than it did to go back to Chicago because that last train stopped about everywhere you could imagine, every crossroad. It was a real milk run, and it took all night. Sometimes we were right on the verge of missing the connection at the other station to go on up to Great Lakes. Never missed it, but sometimes we'd have to jump into a taxi cab and tell that Chicago cabbie to hurry up, and you don't want to do that, or didn't then.
All right. Now, once you completed this next round of training, what was your next assignment?
Well, then at the close of service school, I had done fairly well in service school because of prior training. And I had a choice of where I would serve. I couldn't go to submarines, which I didn't want anyway, but I could have had just about any ship, and the idea of PT training, torpedo boats, had always appealed to me ever since I heard about PTs at the start of the war. And so I signed up for PT service school in spite of the fact that everybody told me don't volunteer for anything.
Right.
But I made PT training, and of course there was a wait involved to get to that training section.
Now, was PT training fairly popular? Was there a competition to get into that?
No. There were 8 openings, and we filled them all from our service school class. And well, then we played the Navy's best game. We waited, and we waited in Boston in a big warehouse they had turned into a barracks for our Navy and for the British Navy and the French Navy.
So were you in there with British and French sailors, or?
Separate floors.
Okay.
We were not encouraged to fraternize with the British or the French.
Now, were there American naval personnel staying with you who had already been out to sea and on ships or convoy duty by then? So when you were sitting around waiting, were there other guys you could meet who had already been out?
There were a few men in the United States Navy section who had been to sea. None who had been in PT action.
Right.
We didn't run into anybody who had been in PT action until we got to the PT school at Melville, Rhode Island.
And was that the next place you went?
That was the next place.
All right. Now, describe the PT school for us. What was the place like, and what did you do there?
Well, it was a very small base. They lived in Quonset huts, and it was quite a bit less regulated than other branches of the Navy. We spent more time on the PT boats and in Narragansett Bay and out in the North Atlantic than we did in classrooms. That was good.
Now, what was there for a machinist to do on the PT boats?
Nothing. That was another irony of service life. I spent high school and the early part of my apprenticeship learning how to be a machinist. And then I went to service school, and I was able to use that, but I was also expected to learn steam propulsion and diesel. Then I transferred to PTs, and that was gasoline. So I've run the gamut of power.
All right, so were you somebody who was going to run or maintain the engines, or what? Or were you just going to be a gunner, or what were you going to do on a PT boat?
I was going to be an engineer. I was going to work in the engine room, and I did. At first, when I finished PT training, I was assigned to the training squadron as an instructor. That wasn't what I went in the Navy for, but that's what they decided I was most fitted for. So I spent...
Now, was that a compliment, or was that a way of keeping you out of trouble?
Well, it was an award because I had not been in trouble. But I didn't consider it an award because I didn't want to be there. I wanted to go to sea and go to war. So I started, I suppose, maybe the first week of instructing to campaign to get out.
All right. Now, about when was it that you started as an instructor? I mean, what were you in 1944 by then, or
that
still
was
43?
In late 43, okay. Probably in December.
All right. Now, how long did it take you to talk your way out of the training position?
About 3 months.
Okay. Now, once that happened, then where did you go next?
There were a few of us that were transferred then from Melville, Rhode Island, PT training school, to Miami, where we caught the same squadron we would have been in if I'd have gone directly to the squadron for shakedown.
But the squadron had already had its shakedown, and
pretty much, yeah.
And were you assigned then to a boat as an engineer?
No, I was assigned to base force. Those are the ones who do the work when a boat comes into harbor and you have a lot of work to do on it. You call in the base crew and they do it while the boat crew goes and has a rest.
Right. Now, what kind of work would you have to do on these boats when they came in?
Well, generally, it would be curing a problem with an engine or with a generator, and you would, in some cases, do a tune-up on one of the three or all three engines. A PT boat had 3 Packard gasoline engines.
How many horsepower were the engines?
1,300 at that time.
Okay, so that's a lot of power for a fairly small boat.
Yeah.
About how long was a PT boat?
Exactly 78 feet.
Okay. And how fast could it go?
Well, the boat that I was assigned to after I got out into the Pacific would make 42 knots.
Okay. And a knot, that's nautical miles. That's longer than regular miles. So
about 1.1 miles.
Yeah. So that's 50 miles an hour or more. Yeah, that's pretty good speed on water. All right. Now, how long were you based in Miami?
2 weeks.
Okay, so not real long then.
No, because I caught up with the same crew that left PT training when I was assigned to instructing.
Right.
They were down there on shakedown, and I caught with the same guys.
Okay. Now, once you rejoined them, were you now going to be an engineer on that boat, or was it still just a part of a larger unit that would go someplace?
Well, I was part of the base force.
You were still part of the base force, but now...
I was not. Yeah. I was not assigned a boat until several months later.
Okay. So once you're with your unit again, then what do? Do you ship out from Miami and go to the Pacific at that point, or what comes next?
We went from Miami to an island called Toboga. That's off of the Pacific end of the Panama Canal. And we continued the shakedown of the boats and basically waited for transportation. And they loaded PTs on tankers. And they could put 4 PTs on a tanker, and we had 15 boats.
So they'd have a boat loaded on the deck of a tanker?
Yeah,
and so they just
cradled right on the top deck.
So you had to wait for enough tankers to come through to load up all the boats?
I had to wait until they got 4 tankers so that they could load all the boats. And then I got separated from them again because there wasn't passage for people who were not boat crews. And so I went on an LST, headed generally for the South Pacific. We passed Hawaii off in the distance and ended up in the New Hebrides Islands.
Okay. Now, when you were on the LST, were you traveling in a convoy at that point or just on your own?
We traveled singly. We did not have another ship around us at all.
All right. Now, this would have been kind of early 44, mid 44 by then? About when was it?
Late 43, early 44.
Okay. But by then, they weren't really too worried about Japanese submarines or something like that?
Well, some people were. Some people didn't really think it was a problem.
All right. Now, what was that trip across the ocean in the LST like?
Well, an LST is a different kind of a ship, and we had no duties. We were just passengers. And I talked my way into duty in the engine room because I'd had diesel training, and the LST was diesel powered. I was able to stand engine room watches, which cut down the boredom of a long trip across the ocean.
What was the weather like when you were going across?
Hot.
Okay. But did you have rough weather or high seas?
No, we did not have any high seas while we were on the LST.
Okay. Now, were people on the LST getting seasick, or had they all spent enough time on the water by now that they didn't have a problem?
Some of our men who had only had short rides on a PT boat were pretty sick. I never did have a problem with seasickness, so I was not sympathetic to any of them.
Mm-hmm. About how long did that trip across to the New Hebrides take, do you think?
How long did it take, or how long did it seem to take?
Well, how long did it take? How long? Well, both, either. Yeah.
Well, I think it took about 4 weeks.
Wow.
It took a long time.
Well, LST was pretty slow.
Yeah.
Did they change course a lot to avoid submarines?
That was their only defense against submarines. Mm-hmm. They didn't have sonar, they didn't have radar, and so everything was visual.
All right. Now, what kind of facility did they have in the New Hebrides when you got there?
Quonset hut in the middle of a palm olive peat coconut farm.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, there were a lot of Americans based in the New Hebrides in different places. Were you close to a lot of other things, or were you off by yourself?
Well, there were Quonset huts scattered throughout the plantation. Mm-hmm. So it was a big receiving ship or base.
Right.
And there were a lot of men in it. People that have come back from combat, people who were on their way like we were to combat. Mm-hmm. So we could hear both sides of it. Some people were anxious to go. Some people were anxious to get on with it.
Were you encountering people now who had served on PT boats, and you have a better idea of what they did?
No. The only contact I had with PT crews were in the training school, mm-hmm. where they would grab the returning PT sailors and use them for instructors.
Mm-hmm. So did you meet guys who'd been based in the Philippines when the war started or anything like that? Or
no. Well,
not that you know of.
The only one that I really knew that I met that had been in action that was ever heard about was John Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And he had an accident with a destroyer in a PT boat.
Right.
Managed to get it cut in half. I have some serious thoughts about that, but I'm not going to say them now.
Okay. Now, did you actually meet him when you were in the training school?
Him.
And was he an instructor at that point, or?
Yeah, he was kind of an advisor at Melville. This is jumping back a ways.
Right.
And
what impression of him did you have at the time? Did he seem like a nice enough guy? Did people get along with him?
Some people got along with him. I didn't. I didn't really have much use for him. He was, we called him Boston hillbillies. Mm-hmm.
It's a little different background from a lot of the rest of you then.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we get you to the New Hebrides. Now, do you transfer someplace else from there, or do you stay based in the New Hebrides for a while?
Well, we waited. We waited in New Hebrides for transportation up to Guadalcanal.
Mm-hmm.
Guadalcanal being north of the New Hebrides, and we finally got passage for a dozen of us on a plane going up to Guadalcanal, a C-47. That's just a cargo plane.
Right.
And then we got to Guadalcanal, and we got there just in time to find out that our squadron had already moved west.
Mm-hmm. So where had the squadron gone?
Well, they went on out to the Treasury Islands,
Mm-hmm.
which was west perhaps 75 to 100 miles. So they put us on a LSD. And that's another class of landing ship.
Mm-hmm.
That's meant to carry just personnel. We were on that for not even long enough to sleep. We were on it in one afternoon. And the only thing I can remember about that trip was that we drank water out of a Lister bag and ate K rations. And the crew of the boat, of the LSD, ate pork chops and stood around waving the bones at us.
All right. Yeah, Navy food's supposed to be pretty good, but they weren't sharing it. All right. Okay, now you get to the Treasury Islands. Now, was your squadron there? So
the squadron was there, and it wasn't very long when I was assigned to a boat. I was taken off base force and put on a PT boat.
Okay. And then what happened? Do you start going out on patrols at that point?
Well, then we went across a narrow stretch of ocean to New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
And across the northern coast of the island of New Guinea, and then we were assigned to a tender. A tender is nothing more than a Liberty ship built to do a specific job. And they carried our ammunition, our food, our gasoline, just about anything that we were going to need was on that tender. So that was assigned, they were part of our squadron.
So that enabled the squadron to move around. You didn't have to stay at one port or base?
We had no land base at that time. And our next stop was several hundred, like actually almost 1,500 miles north to the Palau Islands.
All right. Now, once you got up there, what were you doing?
We were doing patrols. We were doing air-sea rescue. At one point, the particular boat that I was on undertook to draw fire from a shore battery because we were in a big fleet anchorage on the north end of the biggest island, the Palaus. And we were going between the beach of the island and a coral reef. And that which we intended to draw fire from a artillery piece up in the hills, that happened. And it come pretty close. It took our radar off. And but a Marine Corsair come over and got him with one run.
Okay, so that particular plan wound up working.
Well, it worked fine, and we didn't have any more shells being tossed out onto the aircraft carriers in a fleet anchorage.
Okay, now was this an island where Americans were going to land or take it over, or?
They had already, well, they took it over as much as they were going to.
Mm-hmm.
The Palau Islands were never a principal target.
Right. Well,
and they bypassed several thousand Japanese in the mountains.
Okay. Because one of the islands, Palaus, the Marines went in and took a lot of casualties. They did take the whole island eventually, but there were several others in that chain, and so there's most of the rest of those they bypassed.
Well, we were more concerned with the island of Babelthop, which was the biggest island in the group. and the naval fleet anchorage was just a stretch of ocean surrounded by torpedo nets or submarine nets.
Kind of in between the different individual islands in the group?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, how long did you stay in the Palau area?
Just a matter of a couple of weeks.
Okay. Are there other incidents from that area that you remember or stuff that you did?
Well, I remember that in this fleet anchorage, they were always on the alert. One night they had a submarine warning, and something had gotten through the nets. They figured it was a mini sub, so they scrambled all the PTs, and we were tearing around through the anchorage, and the destroyers were trying to get their sound gear to work, and we were making so much noise they couldn't do anything.
Because the PT boat didn't have sonar or things like that, did it?
No. We did have radar, but we did not have sonar.
So what would you do about a mini sub other than just find it if it was on the surface?
Well, we did carry depth charges, but we never got close enough to know that there was a sub down there, and neither did the destroyers. Then on one other occasion, a Japanese soldier was swimming with a floating mine. He was pushing that mine toward the Yorktown, and he didn't make it to the Yorktown. Rifle fire from somewhere exploded the mine, and I don't think he ever landed any place.
Probably not. All right. Now, from Palau, where did you go after that?
We went up to the Philippines directly. We went under our own power. That was a long run, about 1,500 miles from the Palau Islands to Leyte Gulf.
Okay. Now, did the squadron all go together?
We went, yes, as 15-boat squadron, and we all went together.
And did you get to Leyte Gulf at the time of the initial invasion, or did you get there later?
We got there about 2 days after the invasion.
Okay. Now, there was a large naval battle that took place in that area, and did you get caught up in that, or did you come in after that?
That was done. It seemed like we were too late for everything, because we didn't mind it at the time.
Well, that was one naval battle you might not have wanted to be in.
That was a tough one.
Now, what was the Gulf or the landing area like? I mean, what did you see when you got into Leyte Gulf? Was there still a lot of ships in there, landing stuff going on?
There was a good amount of shipping in there, mostly naval, some supply ships, but several destroyers. And we were just off the village of Tacloban, and we were honored to have liberty in Tacloban a couple of times and go through their markets. But they quickly got used to being not having the Japanese around and being at peace, to having the American soldiers and sailors around. So they were good to us.
Now, did they have much? I mean, what could they do for you? They probably wouldn't have had a lot of things to sell, probably.
Well, you can always sell bananas and other tropical fruit.
That was just all growing in the area?
Yes.
Was it sort of jungle there? We're pretty close to it? Or
what was left of it after the shelling. Palm trees make a terrible sight when they're knocked down with cannons of fire.
About how large was the village, do you think, the Tacloban? About how many people do you think were there?
I would think that not more than 1,500. That's a guess.
And were the Americans busy building facilities there? I mean, I think there was an airfield there and that sort of thing.
Not at that particular place. They were using aircraft carriers for their landing fields, and There were no Army Air Corps there.
Right. Okay. Now, how long were you based in Leyte Gulf then? Did you stay there for a while?
No.
Okay. Where'd you go next?
Well, the next point of interest was Okinawa, and we loaded on LSDs, which is a landing ship dock. It actually is just a big dry dock, and we could put a half a dozen PTs in the well deck. And so we went up to Okinawa by boat, by somebody else's power. We were passengers.
Okay. Now, when you're up in these areas, you're in the Philippines, and then you go over to Okinawa. Did you have trouble with Japanese aircraft, or did you see kamikazes come in?
We didn't have any trouble with Japanese aircraft until we got to Okinawa. We were in Naha Harbor, and we had bent a shaft getting out of the LSD when we tried to pull our boat out.
Right.
Because there was an air raid going on at the minute. And so we had bent a shaft, and we had to find a shallow place where we could work on that shaft, and we took it out with the boat still in the water. And we pulled the shaft and put a new one in. And I was doing most of the work under the boat, and with, of course, diving gear. And
what did diving gear consist of at that point?
well, at that time, we didn't have what is known as scuba gear.
Scuba, yeah.
We had just a helmet that went down and rested on our shoulders, and you had to stay erect, because if you'd lean over, the water would come up across your face. It's hard to breathe that way.
So you did get to use some of your machinist training after all, at least underwater.
No.
We had gotten you to Okinawa, and you were talking about sort of fixing the propeller shaft for the PT boat. Now, once you get that fixed, now do you start going out on patrols at that point? Do you have work to do?
We did some patrols, but largely our work was air-sea rescue. When a plane would come back from a run, and generally the run was over Japan, they sometimes got shot up and would not be able to land, or they would be so bad that they'd have to leave their plane. Then we would go out and chase parachutes.
Right. So that was kind of a regular routine. They would get close enough, so they had enough fuel to get there, but then they were damaged enough they just couldn't land properly. The air wouldn't work.
But that didn't always happen, that they had fuel enough to get close, and they were hard to find. And so it seemed like they always had to ditch at night.
So how far away from Okinawa would you go to find these guys?
Well, if we had plenty of observation and somebody knew approximately where the pilot was down, we would go 100 miles.
About how many guys do you think you managed to find? About how many men do you think you rescued?
Well, I know that our boat rescued 3. And other boats, a similar amount, I would guess.
Okay. Now, during this period, you were based in Naha Harbor most of the time, so you were...
No.
Okay.
We moved into an old Japanese sub-harbor, or sub-base, up on the northeast corner, or northwest corner, I'm sorry, of the island of Okinawa, right directly across from the island of Ieshima. The only reason that island's important, that's where Ernie Pyle was killed.
Right. And just a little islet there that they took over early on in the campaign. Yeah. But otherwise, you're pretty well away from most of the area of the fighting, which was down on the southern end of the island that the Japanese had fortified.
And there were a lot of Japanese on the island between the installations in the south and where we were up on the northwest corner.
Now, would they come into the base or try to steal food, or were they a danger if you went off the base? Or
We didn't have too much difficulty with the Japanese people who were not in airplanes. We had periodic aircraft come over at night and bomb us, but that was a small thing.
Mm-hmm. But you were not in an area where you'd be attacked by kamikazes or things like that?
Not when we got up there. We had we experienced the kamikazes when we were in Naha Harbor.
Right.
And in fact, when we offloaded 2 of our 4 torpedoes into a supply ship, we had just pulled away from the ship. We're perhaps 200 yards away when a kamikaze hit at the hatchway where we put the torpedoes in.
Did that sink the ship? Did that sink the ship?
Yeah, because the torpedoes had been put in there for days. As we'd get an opportunity, we'd offload 2 torpedoes to each boat, and it took a while. And so that deck of that ship was full of torpedoes, and that plane flying into that, trying to get into that little hatchway was not good.
So at that stage, you really wouldn't need the torpedoes on the PT boats because there weren't any Japanese ships left to shoot at? I mean, you were offloading torpedoes.
At that stage, the Japanese Navy was pretty well decimated.
Right.
But we still carried them. We carried 2. We took off 2 and had carried 4 out there. Mm-hmm. And frankly, the PT I was on never fired a torpedo in anger.
I mean, did your boat ever really get into much actual combat? I mean, you had the one point at Palau where you were a target, but did you have anything to shoot at? Or
no, not there. But at Okinawa, we had occasion to shoot at aircraft, mm-hmm. and they would make strafing runs on the PTs, and we felt that we had personally taken care of 3 Japanese fighter planes. Mm-hmm. And whether we were right or not, we had no way of knowing because something caused them to go into the ocean.
Now, were any of those pilots captured, or did they all go down with their aircraft?
They had this death wish, I think. Mm-hmm.
Now,
the kamikaze mentality is a Japanese trait.
Now, did you see any Japanese prisoners while you were on Okinawa?
Not while we were on Okinawa. We saw some in New Guinea. Mm-hmm. We saw a couple prisoners in the Palaus, in fact.
And what did they look like to you? Did they seem to be kind of in bad shape, or did they make any particular impression on you at the time?
Well, it was hard to think of them as people, mm-hmm. because they were enemies. And yet they didn't look that much different. We had Americans that looked more Oriental than the Japanese did.
All right. Now, did you stay based at Okinawa until the war ended?
Yes. We were at that torpedo or that submarine base until the armistice was signed. Mm-hmm. And then we went back to the Philippines, back to Leyte Gulf.
Now, do you remember hearing about the dropping of the atomic bomb?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And how did you respond to that news, or did you recognize that this was something that might end the war? Or?
Well, we felt certain that it would end the war. Mm-hmm. We were not having very much success in discouraging the Japanese with bombing runs on their major cities, including Tokyo. But when you wipe out a whole city with one bomb, that changes minds.
Mm-hmm. And shortly after that, then they do make peace. Now, what was the response at your base when the news came that the war was over?
Well, it sounds like a good time to go home.
Mm-hmm.
We'd been in the South Pacific or in a Pacific theater for the better part of 2 years, and even then, that was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had not been home for 30 months. So I was ready for it to end, and so that's what happened.
Okay. Now, before we leave Okinawa, when you're based there, did you have a fair amount of off time or time when you were on shore and not out there on the boats?
We had, we had a series of tents that we lived in on the base in Okinawa, and we never slept on the boats when we were in port. The only thing we did was general maintenance on them and try to protect them from windstorms, because that base was not built to withstand a typhoon, and that big typhoon in August of '44 did some numbers on us, and we had to work a lot to drive pilings so that the PT didn't come up and down with the waves and hit on the pilings, on the top of a piling. We had to drive new ones. So
because the PT boat, that was made of plywood, wasn't it?
It was all plywood.
Yeah, so if you land on a piling, you'll just hold the
You
boat
just
right
put a
away.
hole in it, yeah.
All right. Now, what would you do when you were on shore, when you were not on duty? How would you spend your time?
Sleep.
Was there any entertainment provided, or did you have radios or anything else like that?
Oh, we had radios. We could listen to Tokyo Rose tell us how we were losing the war, and then we up there in Okinawa, we never had a USO troop come through. We had sports. I learned to play softball in the Navy. There was other things. I did a lot of boxing too. All of these things aren't good for me, but
Well, they're better for you than some other options there might be, like drinking a lot. Right.
that wasn't an option.
Yeah, you were pretty well away from a lot of stuff. There probably weren't that many opportunities to get in trouble on your end of the island.
No, there were. I tried to visit an Army friend in the South. I borrowed a Jeep to go down and see him. We had to go rigged with a sidearm and a rifle because there was so many Japanese on the island between us. And I had no encounters along the way, but I was able to drive the Jeep down to the south end of the island and back, and no problem.
Okay. Did they let you actually go see your friend?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, was he in a line unit or in the rear areas, or?
Well, he was a soldier, and he was waiting for further orders, hoping to go to Japan and end the war.
Okay. So this was after the Japanese on the island had been defeated, then?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how long was it after the war ended that they moved you over to the Philippines? Was that pretty quick? Or?
Oh, a matter of weeks.
And then once you got to the Philippines, where did you go?
We went back to Leyte Gulf and prepared our boats to store them forever. And that included taking out everything that we could use on something else. And at first we thought that they were going to maybe sell them to the Japanese government or to the Filipino government. But we run them up a river and on the island of Samar, which was right across the Gulf from Tacloban. And we took off everything that we could get off, like machine guns and torpedoes. Torpedoes they saved because they could use those with the aircraft, but the machine guns, they just threw in the ocean. And we actually drove a lot of Jeeps into the ocean as well.
Okay. Interesting use of Army surplus at that point, but all right. How long did you stay in the Philippines then?
I I couldn't tell you in a matter of days or weeks. It wasn't long, and we caught a seaplane tender then, and we sailed from the Philippines up past the Aleutian Islands and down to Seattle.
And what was that trip like as opposed to the ones you'd done before?
That was great. We were going home.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, was it colder, or was the weather worse, or did you not really pay much attention by then?
I did, but frankly, I don't remember the weather. It was hot when we got on in the Philippines. It was January when we made landfall in Seattle.
All right, so you crossed the North Pacific in the winter.
Yeah. And so we landed in Seattle. It seems like it took us as long to go up Puget Sound as it did to cross the ocean.
Because by then you're thinking you're home, you want to be off the boat by then.
Yeah.
Okay. And then from Seattle, do they just put you on a train and send you back to Great Lakes to be discharged? Or?
That's what happened. We got chair car transportation from Seattle to Chicago, and then back to Great Lakes for discharge.
Okay. So when did you actually get home?
My papers say I was discharged on the 23rd. I didn't remember that. I thought I was discharged on the 19th, but my papers say it was the 23rd, so I guess it was the 23rd.
So February 46?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, once you got back home again, did you go and stay with your parents, or did you have your own place to go?
Well, I had a 30-day leave, and I had a girlfriend in Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
I had to go break up with her.
Okay.
And so that took up part of my 30-day leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would take me through January, and in February I went back to Great Lakes for a discharge.
And then did you come back to the Grand Rapids area after that?
Yes.
All right.
Back to my job at the General Motors plant over on 36th Street.
Mm-hmm.
But they were struck. They were on strike in early 46, and so I couldn't go back to work.
So what did you do?
Drew unemployment.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there a plan set up for veterans? Could you get a certain amount of money every month because you'd been in the service, or?
Not because I'd been in the service, but because I qualified for unemployment.
Okay.
That's
So how long did that go on?
Well, I got back in January, and I didn't get back to work till April.
Now, once that started up again, did you stay with General Motors for a long time after that, or?
Short time. I retired from General Motors in 1982. So I'd been there 40 years. Mm-hmm. Counting my service time, I'd been with General Motors for 40 years.
Well, to look back on the experience now, how do you think the time you spent in the service wound up affecting you? Maybe in terms of how you view the world or deal with people or anything else?
Well, I was always kind of shy,
mm-hmm.
and I come out of the service with a lot more confidence in myself. I knew I was good at what I did. Mm-hmm. If they could ever catch me doing anything. I learned one of the old Navy tricks too. I could goof off with the best of them.
Mm-hmm. All right. Are there other particular events or things about that time that you spent in the Navy that kind of stick with you or come back to you a lot that you haven't mentioned here yet? Just people you met or things that happened?
I don't think so.
Okay. There probably will be after we turn the camera off.
As soon as the camera's down.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to come in and talk to us today.
Thanks for letting me.